This morning, the old radio played his voice. Not a recording, not an impersonation. It was him, Hank, the man who had died 10 years ago. Ruth bolted upright in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. The mahogany-colored radio on the corner table crackled softly. Then came the unmistakable strum of his guitar. And then, his voice. Sweet Carolina rain, the kind that kissed your hair. No, it couldn't be. She clutched the armrests, breath shallow and shaky. The house was silent, just like every morning. A soft wind crept through the cracks in the windows, but the song, that song, carried through the room like time itself had unraveled. It had been 10 years. 10 long years since the accident, since she'd last heard that melody. No one played it anymore. No one remembered it. And Ruth, she had tried so many times to burn the old recordings, to silence the past that screamed in every note. It was too painful to hold on to a voice that no longer belonged to this world. And yet, this morning, before the sun had fully risen, he sang. A part of her wanted to believe it was just a cruel joke of fate, some fluke of static and memory. But another part, the part that had waited silently through a decade of grief, whispered something else. Some people leave, but never truly go. And that old radio, scuffed, dusty, but lovingly cleaned every week, had become something else entirely. A threshold, a doorway to something long buried, a passage back through time where love doesn't ask for permission to return. On a small hill just outside the town of Clayton, North Carolina, sat a white wooden house nestled among magnolia trees. Each morning, the mist curled through the branches like silk scarves, and every evening, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over Ruth, either knitting or quietly rereading an old letter. Everyone in town knew her, not because she was loud, not because she was wealthy, simply because she had become part of the town's memory, like the oak tree on Main Street, like the old bakery with the chipped bell, like the church chimes every Sunday morning. Ruth was in her 60s now. Her silver hair was always tied neatly behind her head. She had a small, slightly stooped figure, but her eyes, still glass clear, carried something special, a calm knowing of someone who had lived long enough to stop rushing. Her husband, Hank, used to play guitar in a local band. They married when Ruth had just turned 21, a simple wedding filled with music and laughter. Hank was never famous, never wealthy, but wherever he was, people felt safe. 10 years ago, a rainstorm took him away. Driving home from a small church concert, his car slid off the road and into a ravine. They said he died instantly, painlessly. But to Ruth, it felt like the sound had been torn from her heart. Since then, the house had become too quiet. The 4-chair dining table only saw one in use. She still cooked, but often didn't eat. She still brewed tea, but let it cool. She still tended to flowers, but no one came to admire them. Each morning, Ruth brewed a pot of tea, sliced a piece of cornbread, and sat by the window in her old armchair. In front of her stood an antique radio, the first gift Hank ever gave her, bought with money from a lakeside bar gig. The radio had once broken, but she had it repaired, not because it was valuable, but because she couldn't bear the thought of discarding something that held his voice. She didn't tune in to any particular program. She simply turned it on, like listening for wind, for passing time, or maybe hoping that one day a familiar melody would return on its own. There were times she tried to travel. Her daughter, now living in Raleigh, begged her to move in, but Ruth always declined. "I'm fine," she would say. "It's just that here I can still hear him." The house, though old, was always clean. A fresh vase of flowers sat on the table, usually white chrysanthemums or sprigs of lavender. A framed photo of Hank hung on the wall, smiling, his hand around a weathered guitar with a chip in the neck. Behind the house was a small garden of tomatoes, onions, and peppermint. Every evening, Ruth still cooked. For habit, yes, but also to keep alive the flavors Hank once loved. Sometimes she wondered, had Hank really gone? Or was he just somewhere beyond a layer of cloud? On some nights, she'd wake, not from a nightmare, but from the sensation that someone had just sat beside her. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was something beyond what we understand. Whatever it was, Ruth held on to one ritual. Every morning at precisely 6:15 a.m., she turned on the radio. Not for the news, but to remember she was still here. They met on an April afternoon in 1981. Ruth was a young waitress working part-time at a roadside diner. Hank, a wandering guitarist with a scruffy charm, had ducked in, looking for shelter from the rain. His shoulders were soaked, but the way he looked at her felt warm. He ordered a sweet tea. She brought it over with a slice of cornbread, on the house. Their first conversation was short, just a few words exchanged. But when he walked back out into the drizzle, Ruth knew something had quietly begun inside her. A few days later, he returned. This time, he brought an old guitar. Sitting in the corner booth, he played a song he'd written himself, Sweet Carolina Rain. Every lyric sounded like it was meant for her, the girl with the deep brown eyes and that slow, easy smile. They fell in love the way people in small towns do. No grand gestures, no drama, just the right person at the right time. Evenings by the lake, quiet nights on the porch, listening to the radio, holding hands without needing words. That's how they built something lasting. Their wedding was small, maybe 30 guests, a 2-tiered cake, and a band made up of Hank's closest friends. But the laughter that night felt like the whole world had come to bless them. Years passed. Hank played music on weekends, and Ruth became a school teacher at the local elementary. They never had much money, never sought fame, but their little home was always filled with laughter and the sound of music. Every night before bed, Hank would read to her, from whatever book he was into that week. The words didn't matter. It was his voice she loved. Sometimes, Ruth pretended to fall asleep, just to hear more. Other nights, she took a turn reading, just to switch roles. They lived like that for nearly 30 years, long enough to know peace isn't found in big things. It's in a shared roof, a long hug, and someone who always comes home. Then, one winter night, after playing a charity gig at the church, Hank didn't come home. The call came at 11:17 p.m. A police officer explained his car had slipped off the road in the rain. They said he likely died instantly. Ruth felt the world freeze. In that moment, all sound in her life stopped. The funeral happened 3 days later. The entire town showed up. The man who sang every Friday night, who smiled through storms and sunshine, now lay in silence. Ruth didn't cry at the funeral. Instead, she quietly held his old guitar and sat alone in their living room, playing Sweet Carolina Rain one last time from an aging cassette. Then she placed the tape away in a drawer and never played it again. The months that followed were wrapped in silence. Each morning, Ruth still rose early, still tended the garden, still made breakfast. But no one heard her laugh out loud anymore, and from that white wooden house, no music came. Sometimes she'd sit by the window for hours, holding a cold cup of tea, eyes fixed on the hill where Hank once said, "If I ever go first, remember, my love will never grow old." There were nights she'd wake, certain she heard a guitar strum in the dark. Maybe it was the wind, maybe memory, but Ruth never tried to explain it, because in her heart, Hank had never truly left. That night, the sky seemed ready to pour out all its tears. Rain draped the magnolia trees like a curtain, each droplet landing on the wide leaves, shimmering like tiny pearls under the porch light. Wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, like the weary sigh of the lonesome hills. Inside the old wooden house, Ruth sat by the kitchen window, silently watching the rain. The soft amber glow of her table lamp barely held back the damp darkness of the night. She hadn't fully turned off the old radio the night before, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she'd catch a fading echo of Sweet Carolina rain again. But now, with night thick as molasses, she felt a chill run deep beneath her skin. She shivered, placed 2 steaming cups of tea on the table, then slowly made her way to the armchair, wrapped her hand-knit shawl around her shoulders, and watched the rivulets of rain snake down the glass. Suddenly, the radio crackled, like it was waking up from a long slumber. She startled, not believing her ears. But the music wasn't from any regular program. A soft guitar intro whispered through, then a warm, familiar voice rose clearly. "Sweet Carolina rain, like a song I once sang on the porch, for you, each drop a memory." Ruth froze. Something cut deep inside her, painful and beautiful all at once. She leapt to the radio, trembling fingers turning the dial carefully. Outside, the rain poured heavier, as if trying to drown out the world. She didn't dare turn on the lights, didn't even breathe too hard, afraid that if she moved wrong, the song would vanish. It didn't play just once. No, it played 3 times in a row, each version different. First, a soft, tender intro. Second, a fuller version with deeper harmony. Third, Hank's voice, raw and aching, whispering like he was sitting right beside her. "I'm still here, with the night rain falling." When the music finally stopped, there came a gentle knock on the living room door. She told herself it was just the wind, just the rain. But her heart beat loud and panicked. She walked unsteadily toward the hallway, stopping just before the front door. The knock came again. 3 soft taps, steady and strange, like Morse code. Dick, dot, dot. She pressed her hand to the wall, her back cold against the wood. Should she open the door? Her eyes drifted to the hook where the spare key hung. She closed her eyes, took a breath, then slowly turned the knob. The room was dark. Only the porch light stretched a pale gold line through the window, flickering with every drop of rain. She stepped inside, standing right in the middle of the faded rug. It was the same spot where she and Hank had once danced under the moonlight, slow, sweet waltzes with arms wrapped tight. Now, there was only silence and the rain. The radio sat quietly in the corner, dial locked at 88.5 FM, a local station that never played old love songs. She frowned and reached toward it, but then a voice spoke from behind her, clear and unmistakable. "Evening, Miss Ruth." She spun around, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. In the corner, near the old fireplace, stood a man, coat soaked, hat dripping, face lined with time and stormlight. Who are you?" she asked, voice cracking. The man gently brushed off the rain, unwound his scarf, and stepped into the light. And in that moment, his posture, the way he tilted his head just so, the way he always used to shield his guitar from the rain, it was Hank. It had to be. But Hank was gone. 10 years now. So how could he be here, soaked to the bone, standing in this very room? The man let out a soft sigh, ran his fingers through damp hair, and said, "I'm sorry, Ruth. It wasn't easy coming back." She broke. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, eyes wide, lips trembling. You?" she whispered. He gave a small, wistful smile. "It's me, Ruth. I came back to sing for you. I broke that promise 10 years ago, but I'm here now." She wanted to run to him, to hold him, but her legs didn't move. Instead, she sat there crying, hand reaching out, barely touching the edge of his coat, just to be sure he was real. Rain hammered the tin roof. Hank, now seated in the middle of the living room with his old, worn guitar, adjusted the strings carefully. Ruth had helped him into the big chair, the one he used to pull up beside her during their music nights. Now she reversed the roles, placed a pillow behind his back, opened the window wide so the sound of the rain could come in and wrap around them both. Hank's fingers danced over the frets, coaxing a gentle, haunting prelude from the strings. Then came the song, raw and soft, like breath in the dark. "Sweet Carolina rain, can you hear the wind whisper? It's me, coming back through the quiet storm to give you one more night of love." His voice, weathered, warm, cut through the years like a blade of light. Ruth was taken back to their wedding under the magnolia tree, to coffeehouse gigs, to golden fields where they once sang in harmony. Every note seemed to stitch time together again, showing her that love doesn't fade, it waits. When the song ended, Hank rested the guitar gently. Ruth knelt beside him, sobbing into her hands, afraid to touch him too firmly, scared he might disappear. Ruth, whispering, "You're really here." Hank, softly, "We never truly leave each other, Ruth. I had to go, so you'd know how much we need one another." Her tears flowed freely now, but they weren't the kind born of grief. They were tears of broken joy, of wonder. And outside, the rain kept falling, as if the world had paused to witness this reunion. When the final note faded, Hank looked at her with tired but kind eyes. Ruth tried to speak, but no words came, just breath and memory. Hank, gentle, "Tomorrow, when the sun's out, I'll tell you everything. But tonight, we've already got enough time." He led her back to the kitchen, where the tea still steamed and an old photo of him smiled from its frame. She picked it up, stared at the eyes in the photo, then back at the real ones. The line between past and present blurred. 10 years of absence melted into mist. They sat, no words needed, just soft sips of tea, the scent of old wood and rain filling the space. Each glance said what words could not. "I never stopped waiting. I never stopped loving." Ruth, barely audible, "Where have you been all these years?" Hank, quietly, "Somewhere you couldn't follow. A place where silence bends every song into memory. But I heard you, Ruth. I saw your porch light, and I came back, so we'll never be apart again." Hank pulled up the cushion from the armchair and revealed a small, rusty metal box. Inside lay a cassette tape, faded and brittle. The handwritten label read, "Sweet Carolina rain, do not air. Do not air." Ruth gasped. She stared at the tape, at the label, and then at Hank. Ruth, shaken, "Why now? After all this time?" Hank, "Because if waiting gets you nowhere, then a song's the only way to reach who's still listening. I mailed that tape to the station yesterday. They aired it last night as part of a local tribute. You were the first one to call." She placed her hand on the tape, tears falling freely. So many years of hurt, all caught inside this moment. Ruth whispering, "I never dared dream you'd come back like this." Hank touching her hand, "I never truly left. I've always been here, in every melody, in every drop of rain, in every porch light you kept burning. And now, we're here, if only for this one rainy night." The next morning, Ruth sat by the window, the very same window where she had waited for Hank all those years ago. There was no porch light on anymore, no glow left to welcome anyone home. But the sun that day was unusually bright, almost as if it had a secret of its own. The sunlight spilled onto the old wooden table where Ruth held a fountain pen, beginning to write a letter, something she hadn't done in decades. The letter was for Hank. Not to send, not to reply to, but to finally say all the things she had kept buried inside her heart. "My dear Hank, I don't know why I'm writing these words. Maybe it's because I've held them inside for so long. Or maybe because last night, when I heard your voice from that old radio, my heart finally stopped aching. I blamed you. I resented you for leaving without a word. But I also missed you, every day, every year. The porch light wasn't just for the children, it was for you too, the one I never stopped loving. Last night, I saw you, not in a dream, but flesh and blood. And the miracle is, I didn't feel lonely anymore. I will keep living, not to wait for anyone, but to remember you, with all the gentle love and gratitude I still carry." She placed the letter inside an old tin box, the very box where she had kept their keepsakes. It lay deep in a dusty drawer, untouched for years. Today, for the first time in so long, she opened it. Inside were old letters, the ticket from their first concert together, the hair clip Hank gave her for her 30th birthday, and a black and white photo, Hank holding her from behind, his eyes looking at her like she was the whole world. Ruth didn't cry anymore. Her hands trembling, she took out a cassette tape from the box, the recording of the song Hank sang to her on their very first dance in the backyard. This time, she decided she would share it. That afternoon, Lily, her youngest granddaughter, came to visit. 15 years old, with clear eyes and curly hair just like Ruth when she was young. The two sat on the couch, and Ruth placed the cassette player on the table. "Today, I want you to hear something," Ruth said softly. "It's a song your great-grandfather Hank sang to me a very long time ago." Lily giggled, curious and excited. But when that warm, rough voice filled the room, the air grew still. Something beyond time and generations connected them. The song wasn't perfect. There were a few off beats, the wind howling in the background, but that was what made it real. Real people, real love, memories alive again. "How did you and great-grandpa love each other, Grandma?" Lily asked. Ruth smiled gently, eyes glistening but not sad. "You know, some people only pass through our lives, but they leave footprints that never fade. Your great-grandpa, he wasn't just a husband, he was a piece of my heart." Lily rested her head on Ruth's shoulder. "Someday, I want a love like that too, even if just once." Ruth stroked her granddaughter's hair, saying nothing more. She knew the most precious thing she could leave behind wasn't wealth or advice, but a beautiful memory, a melody that could live on, like the sound of that song. That evening, Ruth went out onto the porch and stood quietly before turning off the light. For the first time in many years, she didn't leave the porch light burning overnight. Not because she'd given up hope, but because she understood. She didn't have to wait anymore. The one she waited for, the one she loved, had come back in a way her heart could finally understand. In the days that followed, Ruth gave the tape to a local radio station with a simple request. May anyone who needs to hear find some peace in this melody. Soon, music lovers in town started talking about Hank as a living legend. The story spread through the region. There's a song, buried in a drawer for 20 years, now playing again on a rainy night. Whoever listened to Sweet Carolina Rain didn't just remember Hank, they were reminded to believe in love, that no matter how cruel loss might be, it can still give us a reason to live. From a woman who had almost given up on herself, Ruth found a new purpose: to preserve and share Hank's song. She promised to tell her grandchildren, her children, and everyone the story of the man who sacrificed so much so their love could live on forever. Some people are no longer with us, and yet they never truly leave. Not in the way they looked, not in the words they used to say, but in the quiet things. In an old song playing through a dusty radio. In a wool scarf that still smells like the wind. In the light falling through a window just before dusk. Hank is gone, but he lives on. In Ruth's memories, in the glimmer in Lily's eyes, in the melody of a love song echoing across time. Ruth has learned to go on, not by forgetting, but by holding on, just enough to warm the heart, not enough to burn it down. Love can't undo the past, but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us moving forward. And once in a while, on a quiet night, when the wind rustles through the trees and the radio hums an old familiar tune, you might see them, the ones you loved, the ones you lost, the ones you waited for, maybe your whole life. Not a dream, not a ghost, but something real, in sound, in wind, in the way you choose to live, even now.